Buenas tardes a todos. Y yo soy Jaime Moreno, el director del Centro Sefarad Israel. Esta actividad primero la realizamos conjuntamente con la Federación de Comunidades Judías de España, con la que tenemos una excelente relación, y con dos personas, el chavala y Amit Orman, los cuales pues, no hubiese sido posible este año. Y este acto, en primer lugar, quería explicar un poco lo que es el Centro Sefarad Israel para aquellos que no conocen, porque veo hoy mucho público nuevo y algo que me agrada mucho, y la verdad que me gustaría explicar brevemente lo que hacemos en el Centro Sefarad Israel. El Centro Sefarad Israel es una institución pública que depende del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores, y básicamente lo que hacemos es promover la cultura judía, y fue una misión que se estableció desde el año 2006 con el ministro Monatino, que busca tender puentes con las comunidades judías en España y alrededor del mundo, y con el Estado de Israel. En ese sentido, realizamos numerosas actividades, exposiciones, tenemos ahora mismo 2 en Sefarad, realizamos diálogos como el que vamos a tener hoy, sobre la situación política actual de Israel, y en general colaboramos con instituciones públicas y privadas, y eso significa que hoy estamos colaborando con una institución pública como es la Federación de España, con una institución privada, en este caso con 2 personas físicas que han contribuido a convocar al público y a todo lo que rodea este acto. En primer lugar, hoy vamos a escuchar el testimonio de 3 jóvenes israelíes que han venido expresamente a contarnos cómo han vivido, cómo vivieron los terribles atentados terroristas de Hamás el 7 de octubre. Después tendremos la intervención de 2 ponentes que nos hablarán de la situación actual que vive Israel y las posibles salidas a esta situación, que no deja de ser un callejón sin salida, del que en algún momento hay que buscar una salida, y entre todos estoy seguro de que el mundo occidental lo vamos a encontrar. Así que muchas gracias. Ahora vamos a presentar a los 3 jóvenes, cuyos nombres son Shani Kaner, Igan Zadinkevich y Asad Vina. Gracias.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, dear all. Thank you for having us. We are the Eshel group from kibbutz Kfar Aza. We are 26 years old, and we have all known each other from day one. Kfar Aza, our home, is just 1.5 kilometers away from Gaza. Before the tragic events of October 7, it was a beautiful and peaceful kibbutz with a small, close-knit population. Kfar Aza was more than just a place to live. It was our community. Unfortunately, on Saturday, October 7th, our community and our world were shattered. At around 6:30 a.m. that day, the whole of Israel, and especially the south, where we are from, was under heavy rocket attack. We are used to the sirens, and we all ran immediately to the safe rooms in our homes. But this time, we realized quickly that something different was going on. The sirens didn't stop, and soon we could hear Hamás terrorists walking around our kibbutz, shouting, looking to slaughter as many people as possible. We learned later that an estimate of 3,000 Hamás militants forced their way into Israel that morning. They invaded around 30 kibbutzim, small villages and towns, and a couple of cities in the south of Israel. They killed 1,400 people and kidnapped 240 into Gaza. The large majority of the victims and the hostages are innocent civilians, children, babies, elderly people. The entire family were murdered at their own homes. Among the victims, there are also foreign workers, Muslims, and citizens of other countries. We are here to tell you what we went through that day. We feel the world may have forgotten the horrific events of that day. Our stories and the stories of our group are only one example of what happened to all of the community around us. We would like to share with you our experiences and tell you a little of what our country and our people are now going through.
We will start by introducing ourselves. Shani Kaner spent 30 hours in a safe room with her parents, with no electricity or water, when Hamás terrorists were in the house. Bar struggled against Hamás terrorists who tried to force open the safe room door in his flat. Bar managed to save himself and his partner. At the same time, at his parents' house, his father, who was trying to protect themselves with the safe room door, was injured when Hamás terrorists threw an explosive device at the door. Bar's mother and sister fought to save his father's life. Moshe Rabbi was aboard with his family that Saturday. He helped contact some of his friends and neighbors with security and military forces. Asad Wiener was in the safe room with his parents and grandmother. He and his father fought against Hamás terrorists who tried to force open the safe room door. One of his brothers waited for rescue for over 20 hours. His other brother was murdered, while allowing his wife escape and save herself and their 1 month old daughter. His cousin and their husband were also murdered by Hamás terrorists at their home, while protecting their 10 months old twins. Yuval Talker spent 30 hours in the safe room with their parents, with no electricity. All the while Hamás terrorists surrounded their home. Shachar Ettinger was in the safe room with his family for 24 hours, while Hamás terrorists were trying to force it open. He took control of the situation and protected his parents. Eden Ettinger, Shachar's twin sister, she wasn't at the kibbutz that morning. She helped direct the security forces to her family home and save their lives. I am Liran Tzadikevich. My father, Omen Tzadikevich, was also murdered that day. He tried to reach the local war room to warn people, but terrorists were waiting for him in the parking lot and shot him to death. My uncle was murdered too, and my grandmother, an 83-year-old woman, spent 28 hours alone in a safe room, holding the door handle against the terrorists. The foreign member of our team group couldn't attend this special event. Moran Shtal was away from the kibbutz that morning. His mother was murdered by Hamás terrorists in her safe room. Yoni Aviani was aboard on the day of the attack. His father, Shachar, the local safety officer, was killed while he the standby squad in an attempt to protect the kibbutz. His uncle was also murdered. Yali Doron, for 24 hours, she couldn't reach out to her parents and was left in the dark as their well-being and whether they were alive. Her parents were eventually rescued. Her aunt and their cousin were murdered. Zohar Luton was aboard on the day of the attack. His sister and their partner were injured by Hamás terrorists while trying to protect their safe window. Eventually, they managed to escape through the window, where shooting was being fired at them. His hand was never. Matan Sobol. His brother spent 24 hours in the safe room. His two cousins are currently being held hostage by Hamás in Gaza. Razi Tamari. Both their parents were murdered after having fought for their lives against Hamás terrorists. Their house was destroyed and burned down while they were inside. Tragically, 4 of our dear friends are not with us today. One was killed, and the 3 others are being held captive. Guy Moni, our dear friend, and his disabled mother were murdered by terrorists. They are found hugging each other in their safe room. Guy was a person of strong values, a loyal friend with big heart. There are not enough words to describe who he is and who he was to us. He will remind you of our hearts forever. Alon Shimris was supposed to start studying data engineering this year. Alon plays basketball on the local team. He lived and breathed sport. He used to spend time with his feelings and without books alone. Alon was partnered in the family business and mostly flourishing career. On Saturday morning, Alon was kidnapped from his home. Before he was kidnapped, he managed to send a message saying that he saw terrorists in front of him. He told his brother that he was afraid and asked to tell his family that he loved them. Since then, contact with Alon has been lost. Gali Berman and Ziv Berman are twins. They were both kidnapped from their flat, and now they've been hostage by Hamás in Gaza. They have been the best friends since childhood, similar but not identical. They are the center and the light of every event they attend. Gali is out of gold. He is the one you return to help you. Ziv was a great sense of humor, great style, and a very sensitive person. Both of them love to play and watch football, and both of them work out to support the family and fulfill their dream. At 10:30 in the morning this Saturday, they were kidnapped from their apartment. Since then, contact with them was lost. And after 10 days, we received a message that they were in Gaza. Their well-being remain unknown. We pray for their safe return.
There are just over 700 people in the kibbutz. That Saturday, 62 of them were murdered and 19 were kidnapped. Almost 10% of our community. We would like to share some of their stories with you. The Kurz family, Aviv, Livnat, 19 years old Rotem, 7 years old Yonatan, and 15 years old Rivka. This family was brutally murdered inside their home. There were no survivors. Another family is the Goldstein, a family of 6. The father Nadav and the 20 years old eldest daughter, Yam, were brutally murdered in front of their mother, Ham, and the 3 other children, Adam, 17, Gal, 11, and Tal, 9, who were kidnapped to Gaza. Guy and Roy Woderchki, 10 months old twins, were left orphans after their parents, Adam and Tai, were murdered in front of their eyes. For 14 hours, they were alone, thirsty and hungry, and crying non-stop. Hamás used their crying to try to tempt rescue forces to come into their house. Roy's mother, the parents of Idan's family, were also murdered that morning. The children, 9 years old Michael and 6 years old Amalia, who saw their parents covered in blood, hid in the closet for 14 hours until they were rescued. The little sister, 3 years old Abigail, was hiding with the neighbor's family. The father went outside to fight the terrorists. In the meantime, his wife Agar and the 3 children of 3, 10, Yuval 8, and Uriah 4, and Abigail were kidnapped to Gaza. The condition is unknown. This is a collection of individual stories. Each of them shows the courage and the resilience of our community members in face of a terror. But each of them is also a stark reminder of a brutality and inhumanity of the terrorists we face. I will say it again. In kibbutz Kfar Aza, 62 civilians were murdered and 19 were kidnapped. Those civilians were our neighbors, friends, teachers, parents, uncles and aunts. Each one of them had an entire family, hopes and dreams. Those are the names of members of our kibbutz who are now being hosting in Gaza. Agar Brodach, Ofri Brodach, Uriah Brodach, Yuval Brodach, Chen Goldstein, Agam Goldstein, Gal Goldstein, Tal Goldstein, Yotam Chaim, Amit Susana, Kit Sigal, Aviva Sigal, Abigail Idan, Doron Steinbrecher, Richard Tomato, Alon Shimriz, Ziv Berman, Gali Berman. We know who was them and what they are capable of. We are in the dark regarding their well-being, their future, and the future of all those taken hostage in Gaza Strip.
We are living through a nightmare. We know this is all happened far from here, and that it might be hard to understand how it all feels. Imagine yourself waking up on a normal morning in your home, in your safe place, and seeing dozens of bloodthirsty terrorists breaking into your home, breaking into your safe room, where you are supposed to be safe, killing your loved ones in front of your eyes, erasing your existence and all that you know. Imagine that your phone is full of real-time messages from your friends and people closest to you, crying for help while the terrorists were breaking into their homes, setting them on fire. Imagine being unable to help them because you are fighting for your own life. Imagine your family looked up in the safe room without food and water, helpless, knowing that the death is on the other side of the door. Imagine that the last messages you received from your loved ones is that they are terrorists outside their safe room door. Since then, all you hear from them is the sound of silence. Hours passing with you, waiting between hope and despair, not knowing if you will ever see them again. Due to the high number of victims and the horrible acts of Hamás, it took a long time to identify the bodies. Some families waited 4 weeks to be told that the loved ones was gone. Imagine that you cannot attend your best friend's funeral because at the same time you are burying your own brother. Now imagine the hostages. Imagine your little child, helpless, in a dark, cold, and scary place, without mom and dad or anyone to take care of him. Imagine that your wife or girlfriend is there, and you pray that she is not being hurt. Imagine that your grandfather is there, in need of medicine and medical treatment, and no one is taking care of him. Imagine it could be you. October 7th was a day that echoed the horrors of the Holocaust, where the Jews were led to the slaughter. The events of that day cannot be reversed, but we can make sure the hostages are brought back home. We ask that you carry with you the stories we told you today, and that you share them with your friends and family. We want people to know and remember what happened that day. Please join us in raising awareness and demanding the safe return of the 240 people who are held hostages in Gaza. We will not rest until they all return home. Thank you for listening to our stories and for hearing about our loved ones. Thank you for standing with us. And thank you for being a part of our fight for justice, for peace, and for a better future. Thank you.
Probablemente el peor ataque fue el que vivió el 7 de octubre. Para encontrar posibles, para explicar la situación que vive actualmente Israel, salida a esta situación, tenemos dos ponentes que nos van a explicar de manera más desarrollada cuál es su visión. En primer lugar, la doctora Einat Wilff, que es una pensadora de Israel que fue miembro del Parlamento entre 2010 y 2013 y presidenta de la Comisión de Educación del Partido Laborista. También ha sido asesora internacional de mujeres y tiene varios doctorados por la Universidad de Harvard, de Francia, y por la Universidad de Cambridge. Además, ha escrito distintos libros, uno de los cuales es La Guerra del Reloj. Y Alberto Priego, yo mismo Alberto, doctor en Relaciones Internacionales, licenciado en Ciencias Políticas, actualmente profesor de ICADE, y también profesor visitante de diferentes universidades como la de Madrid, Coimbra o la School of Oriental African Studies. Alberto Priego colabora con el Centro Sefarad Israel y acude a las reuniones de la Alianza Internacional de Memoria de los Holocausto. Así que nada, os dejo con estos dos ponentes. Creo que Alberto va a intervenir primero y nada, pues muchas gracias.
Bueno, en primer lugar, dar las gracias a los organizadores por considerar que igual es más cómodo si lo ven, por considerar que puedo aportar algo de interés. Yo lo primero que tengo que decir es que el 7 de octubre yo tendría que haber estado en Israel, en el sur de Israel, y un congreso de estudios israelíes de la Asociación Europea, y bueno, hubo algo que me dijo que no debía ir. Cambié mis planes la última semana y bueno, 2 personas de las que acudían al congreso pues lamentablemente fueron asesinadas, ¿no? Dicho esto, me han dicho que durante 15 minutos pues más o menos hago un resumen histórico de por qué existe el Estado de Israel y cómo se ha desarrollado con sus vecinos. Si yo ahora mismo sacara una kipá, la pusiera y andara por la calle, probablemente, tarde o temprano, alguien me increparía, lamentablemente. El otro día un vecino mío, yo vivo en un pueblo de Madrid, que es judío, le pintaron 2 esvásticas en el coche, le rayaron 2 esvásticas en el coche. Y yo me dedico a estudiar religión y relaciones internacionales, judaísmo, Israel, Islam también. Y siempre o muchas veces, cuando publico alguna cosa o cuando intervengo en una cuestión relativa a Israel, muchas veces me preguntan, ¿tú eres judío? Pero cuando hago lo mismo estudiando el Islam, nadie me lo pregunta. Estos son 3 ejemplos que nos pueden permitir entender por qué se crea el Estado de Israel. El Estado de Israel se crea por una razón muy sencilla: para que los judíos puedan ser judíos sin ningún temor, sin ser perseguidos, sin ser marginados, sin ser increpados. Hay un cantante hasídico que se llama Mordejai Ben David, de una canción que se llama One Day, que pretende explicar un poco qué se siente qué se sintió cuando se creó el Estado de Israel. Dice algo así como un día no tendremos ningún temor y un día nuestras cicatrices y nuestro dolor desaparecerán. Esas cicatrices son muy antiguas y lamentablemente pues muy hondas, ¿no? Y por poner solamente algún punto histórico, la segunda mitad del siglo XIX fue un momento en el cual los judíos pues sufrieron mucha persecución, sobre todo en Europa del Este, y tuvieron que soportar pogromos, como el que ocurrió el 7 de octubre pasado, y fueron profundamente marginados en distintos foros. Y uno de los hechos más sonoros y que probablemente más influyen en la creación del Estado de Israel fue el caso de Dreyfus, que ustedes conocen, un oficial francés judío que fue acusado de espiar para los alemanes. Es verdad que había un caso de espionaje, pero no era culpable y simplemente se le culpó a él por el hecho de ser judío y era sospechoso, saben ustedes, el prejuicio de la doble lealtad, ¿no? Ese hecho hizo que un periodista austrohúngaro, que se llamaba Theodor Herr, pues que estaba cubriendo la corresponsalía de París, pues se inspirara a escribir un libro muy famoso, que es un libro que inspira también el movimiento sionista, que llegara a la conclusión de que solamente mediante la creación de un Estado judío los judíos podrían ser judíos sin miedo a ser perseguidos. Como saben ustedes, pues durante la segunda mitad del siglo XIX, principio del siglo XX, se incrementó la migración judía a la zona que es el Estado de Israel. Y en ese periodo, que hay que aclarar que durante ese periodo no había ningún Estado, ni un Estado judío, ni un Estado palestino, ni un Estado árabe. Era un imperio y había comunidades que se organizaban, distintas comunidades organizadas en miles. Durante ese periodo, los judíos que allí llegaban empezaron a crear instituciones para poder tener un Estado. Este punto se empezó a hacer más claro desde el año 21, en el que el mandato británico pues, incitó a las comunidades a tener un Estado, y aquí volvemos de nuevo al mismo problema. Los judíos fueron perseguidos con pogromos, famosos algunos, como el pogromo de de Jerusalén, el de Hebrón, etc. Pogromos que en muchos casos fueron dirigidos por un señor que se llamaba Qassam, que inspira a Hamás hoy, las brigadas que tiene Hamás para cometer sus tropelías, se llaman las brigadas Qassam, y también hay algún misil que lleva su nombre, ¿no? Durante esos años se fueron organizando, se creó un gobierno, se creó una academia de la lengua, se creó alguna institución más, y en el año 48, como ha dicho el director de Centro Sefarad Israel, declara la independencia, el 14 del 5 del 48, David Ben Gurión, en Tel Aviv, declara la independencia, y en ese momento todos los países árabes atacan a Israel. Eso es importante saberlo. Hay una guerra que llega hasta el 49, y en esa guerra, al final de esa guerra, hay una paz, y también hay un elemento que normalmente no conocemos, no solemos decir. Cisjordania es ocupada por Jordania, y Gaza es ocupada por Egipto, y Jerusalén Oriental es ocupada también por Jordania. El secretario general, que no tuvo una intervención acertada hace unas semanas, habló de 70 y muchos años de ocupación israelí en Gaza, cosa que no es verdad. Desde el año 48 hasta el año 67 estuvo ocupada Gaza por Egipto, y desde el año 2005 a 2023 no hubo ninguna ocupación de ningún ejército extranjero. La Segunda Guerra es una guerra que no tiene mucha trascendencia por lo que estamos hablando, que es una guerra de 56 en la que no hay, digamos, intercambios de territorio. Y la Tercera Guerra, que es la guerra de los 6 días, es una guerra en la que Israel consigue la máxima extensión territorial. Israel decide adelantarse cuando todos los ejércitos árabes se preparaban para atacar de nuevo, y consigue los altos del Golán. Yo les invito al que no le haya visto a ver una serie muy buena que está en Netflix, que se llama El espía, que trata sobre la figura de Eli Cohen, que es alguien determinante, aunque murió años antes, fue asesinado unos años antes. Consigue la península del Sinaí, también Cisjordania o Judea y Samaria, según lo veamos, y Jerusalén Occidental, incluyendo la Ciudad Vieja. Ciudad Vieja, desde ese momento se abre al culto cristiano, al culto judío, y evidentemente al culto musulmán se respeta. Antes no era así, y de hecho durante la ocupación jordana se destruyen muchas sinagogas. En el año 73 llegamos a la última guerra convencional, en la que precisamente el 7 de octubre del 73 las fuerzas sirias y las fuerzas egipcias atacan de nuevo a Israel, mientras Israel está en el día del Yom Kippur, que es el día más sagrado de la religión judía. En unos primeros momentos Israel sufre los primeros días, aunque al final consigue repelerlo. Y ahora voy a pedir a los miembros de la embajada de Israel que tapen un momento los oídos para una cosa que voy a decir. Desde entonces Israel desarrolla armas nucleares porque sabe que esto no lo puede mantener muchos años. No puede que en un momento dado pues acabe perdiendo la guerra. Y esta es la última guerra convencional. Desde entonces se inician unos procesos de paz. El primero de ellos es el de Camp David, que lo firma Anwar al-Sadat, que después es asesinado por firmar la paz con Israel. En un gesto muy valiente, viaja desde Egipto a Jerusalén, a la Knesset, a hacer una oferta de paz. Finalmente se consuman los acuerdos de Camp David, se inicia una época de paz por territorios, se devuelve el Sinaí. En los años 80 hay unos momentos de intervención en el Líbano, en el sur del Líbano. Las comunidades cristianas pues piden ayuda a Israel, y al final de los años 80 lo que tenemos es la primera intifada, que surge en Gaza. Hay un atropello de 4 trabajadores palestinos, y en ese momento surge Hamás como un grupo radical que aprovecha ese descontento, que ese descontento era más social que político. Y desde entonces, bueno, pues Hamás ha sido un actor lamentablemente muy influyente en la vida de Israel. Los años 90 son años, al menos los primeros años, muy buenos, que hay una cierta esperanza. Se firman 2 acuerdos de paz, a mí me gusta decir siempre Madrid-Oslo, porque la semilla la pusimos en Madrid. Uno con Jordania y otro con la Autoridad Nacional Palestina. Se crea la Autoridad Nacional Palestina, se divide Cisjordania y Gaza en 3 zonas. La zona A, una zona de control absoluto de Palestina, de la Autoridad Nacional Palestina. La zona B, una zona de control compartido, economía, política para la Autoridad Nacional Palestina, seguridad para Israel, y la zona C para el control de Israel. La idea era ir progresando sucesivamente, pasando zonas C a las B y B a A's, Pero Hamás, al igual que está haciendo ahora, inicia una campaña de atentados suicidas que va del 94 al 2004 más o menos, con la intención de radicalizar las posiciones en Israel y echar abajo estos acuerdos de paz que eran prometedores. Hay una segunda intifada en el año 2000, al principio del siglo XX, y yo creo que la última esperanza de paz para los palestinos, para los israelíes, pasó en el año 2008 con el famoso acuerdo de la servilleta, en la que el entonces primer ministro Olmert le dibuja una servilleta a Abu Abbas, un plan de paz muy generoso, con un corredor entre Gaza y Cisjordania para que el Estado fuera viable. Y Abbas no responde, le pide un día para responder, dice que tiene que ir a Amán para consultarlo, finalmente no responde, y ese probablemente es la última posibilidad que ha habido de firmar una paz. Entonces, Israel cambia un poco el chip, y busca una normalización de las relaciones con los vecinos. Se empieza a trabajar en lo que luego fueron los acuerdos de Abraham, con los países del Golfo, con Bahrein, con Emiratos, con Marruecos, con quien ya tiene una aproximación, con Sudán, y en las últimas semanas, en los últimos meses, se estaba trabajando también en un acuerdo con Arabia Saudí que pues era bastante plausible que se produjera. Y en esto llegamos al 7 de octubre, en el que Hamás decide asesinar a todos los judíos que pueden en un momento dado. Mueren unas 1.400 personas, unas 250 personas están en cautividad, y el objetivo, más allá del asesinato y de la crueldad, es echar por los aires los acuerdos de Abraham. Esos acuerdos que probablemente hubieran puesto en una situación complicada a la Autoridad Nacional Palestina y lo hubieran llevado a sentarse en la mesa de negociaciones, ¿no? Entonces ese es, en mi opinión, uno de los objetivos, al menos el que no se ve tan habitualmente, de lo que ocurrió el 7 de octubre. Yo me voy a parar aquí, me han pedido que hiciera un recorrido histórico, espero no haberme extendido más de la cuenta, y le cedo la palabra a Einat.
Does it work? Okay, good evening. It's a real honor to be here and to be with you. And it's truly appreciated and moving that you are making the effort and the time to come here and to listen. So I want to share with you some of my thoughts on the deep sources of October 7th. I'm sure you remember that I think about 2-3 weeks ago, the Secretary General of the United Nations said that October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. And when he said that, I thought, yeah, he's absolutely right. October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. It's just a very different vacuum than the one he described. So I want to discuss how I even began to understand the deep roots. I grew up in Jerusalem, part of the Israeli peace camp. As a young adult into the 80s and 90s, I was very excited about Israel's efforts to make peace. I genuinely believed that the idea of land for peace will bring us to the idea of acceptance, of finally having peace. When I could finally vote, I voted for Prime Minister Rabin and later for Ehud Barak, and I really hoped that they would finally bring us peace. The 1990s were a time of euphoria for so many people like me in Israel, in the peace camp. We made peace with Jordan to add to the peace with Egypt. We negotiated with Syria over the Golan Heights. But the real height of the 1990s was the direct negotiations with the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, over the future of the West Bank and Gaza. And like many Israelis of the peace camp, we believed in what Shimon Peres spoke about a new Middle East of peace and economic connections. And when Ehud Barak, an Israeli prime minister of the Labour Party, my party, was elected on a platform of making peace, he went to Camp David. As mentioned here, Camp David was symbolic. This is where Israel negotiated peace with Egypt on the basis of land for peace. And Ehud Barak goes to Camp David to finally get us the peace we've been waiting for so long. And he puts on the table a bold proposal, one designed to address everything we were told that the Palestinians wanted. We were told that the Palestinians are angry, that they're fighting because they want to end the occupation. What is the occupation? It's Israel's military presence in the West Bank and Gaza after the Six-Day War. Israel didn't annex those territories, it governed them through the military. So the proposal was for a fully independent, sovereign state of Palestine. The occupation would end. The military will retreat. Palestine will have a border with Egypt, with Jordan. That's it. No occupation, an independent state of Palestine. That was on the table. And then we are told that the reason we didn't have peace, the reason that Palestinians are fighting us, is because of the settlements. What are the settlements? It's the places that were built where Jews live in the West Bank and Gaza, especially beginning in the 1970s, in the mid-70s. So the settlements were going to be dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land. The independent, sovereign state of Palestine would have emerged with no settlements, no Jews living there. And then we are told, East Jerusalem, that's a big deal for the Palestinians. Well, a word about Jerusalem. That's where I grew up. When people hear the word Jerusalem, they immediately imagine and picture the 1 square kilometer that I fondly call Insanity Central. But Jerusalem since '68 is 100 times that. Mostly Jewish and Arab neighborhoods that I can assure you, having grown up in one, nothing interesting, nothing sacred, nothing holy. So those 99% were going to be divided based on a very simple principle. Jewish neighborhoods to Israel, Arab neighborhoods to Palestine. But even the 1 square kilometer of all the holy sites was going to be divided. The Jewish quarter of the Old City to Israel, the Arab quarter of the Old City to Palestine, the Temple Mount to Palestine, the Wailing Wall to Israel. So Palestine was on the verge of gaining independence, no occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites. All the things that we were told Palestinians wanted, that's what they were fighting for. All that Arafat had to do was say yes. What does he do? Walk away. He walks away in 2000. As mentioned here, Abu Mazen walks away in 2008 from a similar proposal by Ehud Olmert. They walk away. But not only do they walk away, they face no criticism from the Palestinian people. None. not even one Palestinian writing an op-ed in some British paper saying, "Are you crazy? We could have had everything we wanted. Go back to the negotiating room and get us our state." There are no such articles, no such voices. Sometimes people say, well, look, Palestinian society, it's difficult to criticize the Palestinian leaders. It's actually not true. And the Palestinian leaders, Arafat and Abu Mazen, were heavily criticized by Palestinians. But do you know what they were criticized for? They were criticized for daring to negotiate with Israel. They were not criticized when they walked away. So Arafat and Abu Mazen knew that when they walked away from these negotiations, they did what their people wanted. And not only did they walk away to no criticism, what followed was a campaign of brutal violence, especially in the years 2001, 2, 3, 4. Until October 7th, this was the darkest time to live in Israel. Entire families were blown to bits by suicide bombers for going for pizza, for attending a Passover Seder in a hotel. I remember the feeling at the time. There was a feeling that if you just left your home, if you boarded a bus, if you went to a cafe with your friends, you were playing Russian roulette with your life. Because who knew if you'd come back? And this was weeks after Palestinians could have had everything they wanted. Brutal massacres, day after day, week after week. The barbarity, it's not new. So a lot of Israelis, like myself from the peace camp, began to ask a very simple question. What do the Palestinians want? What do they want? They clearly don't want a state and the end to the occupation. They could have had that, and they walked away. They clearly don't care about the settlements. Those could have been dismantled, but they still walked away. They clearly don't care about East Jerusalem. They could have had that, and they walked away. Or you could say, let's imagine there's a scale. And on one side of the scale, you put ending the occupation, an independent Palestinian state, a capital in East Jerusalem, no settlements. All of this is on one side of the scale. There is something on the other side, something that they value so much more, that again and again, when they could have all the things on this side of the scale, but not the other thing, they walk away. What is this other thing that they want so much more than those other things? And during this time, I was meeting with Palestinians, moderate Palestinians. I was doing the research that ultimately became the book, The War of Return. And I realized that the Palestinians always told us what they wanted. We just didn't listen. Or when we did listen, we didn't take them seriously. But they always told us, for decades, what they wanted. From the river, from the Jordan River, to the sea, to the Mediterranean Sea. Palestine will be free of any Jewish state, in any borders. They were very consistent for a century. We didn't listen, or we didn't take them seriously. As I was doing the research for the book, I came across a quote that has become my favorite quote ever since, because in one sentence, it tells the story of the conflict. It's a quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. If you know anything about Ernst Bevin, he was no friend to the Jewish people. He did not support the Jewish desire for independence. But in February of 1947, he goes to the British Parliament to explain why Britain failed to fulfill its mandate, the mandate that it received from the League of Nations after the Ottoman Empire collapsed at the end of World War I, to help the Jews achieve a state. Britain and France fulfilled the terms of the mandate to the Arabs. They created Transjordan and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. But the one people that they did not fulfill the promise to is the Jews. And it's important to understand that when the Ottoman Empire collapsed at the end of World War I, there was a general understanding that the peoples of the empires, the Jews, the Arabs, the Turks, the Kurds, the Armenians, will all get their state. You know, if the Jews would have gotten their fair share of the land of the Ottoman Empire based on their population share of the Ottoman Empire, the Jewish state would have been 6 times the size. But there was an understanding that every people would get a state. There was going to be a state for the Turks, for the Kurds, for the Armenians. Well, the Turks kind of tore up the idea. They did what they did to the Kurds, they did what they did to the Armenians, and Turkey became twice that size. The Arabs tried to do the same with the Jews, to prevent by violence the fulfillment of the promise of the League of Nations, not of Britain, of the League of Nations, unanimously to the Jews to achieve independence. But Britain does not fulfill the promise, the trust that it received from the world to the Jews. So it has to explain why it failed, why it's taking the mandate that it received from the League of Nations and giving it to the heir of the League of Nations, the United Nations. So in February of 1947, he says the following: His Majesty's government has come to the conclusion that the conflict in the land is irreconcilable. He calls it irreconcilable. This is February 1947. There's no state of Israel yet. There's no war, there's no refugees, there's no occupation, there's no settlements. All of the things that we are told are the reasons for the conflict don't exist yet, and already it's irreconcilable. Bevin goes on to say, there are 2 groups in the land between the river and the sea, Jews and Arabs. At this point, the Arabs are called Arabs. Much later, they will be called Palestinians. But for now, they're known as Jews and Arabs. Those are the 2 groups, the 2 nations of the land. It's not an issue of faith or religion. They are 2 groups, collectives, and nations. And he says, each of these collectives has a top priority. The thing they care about more than anything. He calls it the point of principle. He says for the Jews, the top priority is to establish a state. The Jews want a state. They want to be masters of their faith. They want to have a state like all other peoples, a place to call their own. He says for the Arabs of the land, the Palestinians, the top priority, he says, and listen to this, is to prevent to the last the establishment of a Jewish state in any part of the land. That's the conflict. He's not saying the Jews want a state, the Arabs want a state, we're really not sure where to draw the border, so United Nations, please help us. He's saying that as a matter of top priority, the Jews want a state and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. That's it. That's the conflict. People tell you that the conflict is complicated. Maybe there's a lot of details and history and that's complicated. But the essence of the conflict is super simple. The Jews want a state, the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. And this is the conflict from the 1920s to the 2020s. A century in which the Arabs are using all means of violence and barbarity to prevent the Jews from having a state. And as I said, the barbarity is not new. Again, like mentioned here, the massacres, the brutality happened in the 1920s and the 1930s. People do not appreciate the role of Arab brutality in preventing the establishment of a Jewish state in the 1930s. That's when it should have been established. Those were the terms of the mandate. Instead, in what is a long tradition, that when Arabs butcher Jews, the response is to cave into Arab demands, but when Jews fight back, everyone calls for a ceasefire. But there was a caving to the Arab demands, and the door was closed to Jewish immigration in the 1930s. Not enough people understand the role of Arab brutality in forcing Britain to cave in to Arab demands, and what it meant is that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews, were condemned to murder in Europe when they could have left to a country that was ready for them in the 1930s. And the reason that I know that is that only 20 years later, when the Arab world goes through a similar process like Europe of the emergence of states and the collapse of empires, like Europe, they turn against their Jews, but this time, the Jews of the Arab and Muslim world have a country to escape to, which they didn't have in the 30s. And this has been the consistent process, and this is what brings us to October 7th. When Palestinians received the Gaza Strip, the territory of the Gaza Strip, to finally control, unlike the maps, this is the first time that Palestinians actually control land. 80% of Gaza was already evacuated in the 90s as part of the negotiations with the PLO, and the remaining 20% in 2005. That's it. Israel is out. No occupation, no settlements. Do the Palestinians look at this and say, wow, finally we control our own territory and we can show the world what it's like when Palestinians govern themselves. We will turn this into a prosperous Singapore and Dubai on the Mediterranean. No. What they say is great. We now have territory that we can use as a launch pad, literally as a launch pad, to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. That's it. That's what Gaza is. Gaza is the launch pad to liberate Palestine. That's why every dollar that went into Gaza for years has been used to build tunnels, to acquire weapons. Because Palestinians have decided that they don't want to make Gaza into a prosperous place. They want to use it to liberate Palestine. And that's the ideology that created October 7th. And Hamás is not something out of the ordinary. Hamás is merely the most recent iteration of numerous groups of trained murderers that have arisen to liberate Palestine. They were called Fatah and Black September and the DFLP and the Federación and Islamic Jihad. But they all share one goal, the same goal that Palestinians had for the last century. No Jewish state in any borders whatsoever. This is the deep root of October 7th. And I want to say a few words about the deep roots of the response to October 7th. Because what we saw is the eruption of exhilaration, not just among Palestinians, not just in the Arab world, in the West, a certain exhilaration at the prospect of Jews being butchered. And again, to any notion that this is something new, already in Israel's War of Independence, remember there's no Hamás in 1947-48. A convoy of nurses, of doctors, going to a hospital is attacked and burnt alive within the vehicles. And just like happened in the various kibutzím, people who tried to escape the heat were being shot. Bodies were mutilated, and they took photographs. They took photographs in 1948. The GoPro cameras, that's just a new technology, but the instinct is the same. They took photos of the burnt and mutilated bodies of Jews, and they sold them in the markets of the old city. This was already the same brutality. So don't tell yourself a story that Hamas is something different. It is a repeated pattern of how they wage their battles. And the response in the world was also decades in the making. The response did not happen in a vacuum. And it started immediately as news of October 7th came out. They didn't wait for Israel to respond. Those who are now trying to claim that this is because of what Israel did. Already on October 8th, you saw this exhilaration, those responses against Israel. Why? Because for decades now, the world has been subjected to a campaign which I call the placard strategy. Because you see it in anti-Israel demonstrations. You see them on the signs. And the placards say, Israel, Zionism, sometimes they just draw the Star of David, and then they put an equation sign. And the placard strategy has been so effective that everyone knows what's on the other side of this equation. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals colonialism, apartheid, racism, Nazism, genocide. And the placard strategy is not only in placards, it's in the United Nations. It's the Zionism is racism. It's people now talking about genocide. It's whenever an anti-Israel speaker goes on television, gives them 30 seconds, and no matter what the question is, they will manage to say colonialism, racism, apartheid, genocide in the answer. And this creates a refrain in people's minds. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals all these things. Now they want you to think that those things are equated with Israel and Zionism because that's reality. You only need to spend one day in Israel to know that all of that is not true. Those words are chosen
for one purpose and one purpose only. They indicate evil. So what people are subjected to is this refrain of Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil. Now what do you do with evil? Do you negotiate with evil? Do you divide the land with evil? Do you make peace with evil? No. You eradicate evil. And after people have been subjected for so long to the idea that Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil, then children can be kidnapped, people can be murdered in their beds, and the global response would be, they had it coming. They deserve it. What did you expect? And that's what we saw. So if we are ever going to have a different future, one that is different from the one that we had for the last century, we need to understand that nothing less than the changing of the Palestinian ideology will bring peace. Because as long as the Palestinians as a people continue to be committed, and unfortunately, I know it's the one thing everyone wonders about, you do not have dissenting voices for this ideology. As long as the Palestinian people continue to be committed to the idea of liberating Palestine from the river to the sea, of no Jewish state in any borders, even if Israel kills all 50,000 of Hamas's trained murderers tomorrow, another group will rise up to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. It means that every dollar that your country will send to Gaza will continue to go to war because they don't want to make Gaza into their home. They just want to use it to liberate Palestine. So the vision we need is the same kind of vision that the Allies had for Nazi Germany after surrender, for Japan after surrender, for Muslims after the defeat of ISIS. A campaign of denazification, de-radicalization, a campaign that makes it clear to a people that they can no longer hold the previous ideology. That the previous ideology brought them nothing but destruction, and that it's not legitimate. The message that Palestinians need to hear from everyone in the world is that the world will be with them, support them, give them money, if they want to govern themselves in the West Bank and Gaza, by themselves, for themselves. But if they want to govern Gaza and the West Bank in order to destroy the Jewish state, then they need to know that they will have no one's support. That's the kind of determination we need in order to finally get to peace. One of the things I've learned over the years is that when it comes to foreign policy making, and other issues as well, people want to feel good. What does feeling good look like? Calling for a ceasefire, saying you want peace, sending money to Palestinians. But doing good requires doing a lot of things that don't feel good. It's true for parenting, it's true for governance, and it's true for foreign policy. You want to actually do good in this world? It means that sometimes you have to do things that don't feel good. And it means telling the Palestinians things that don't feel good. Like that the war of 1948 is over, and it's a closed case, and that Israel is here to stay, and that they can build their state next to the Jewish state, but not instead of it. Not a lot of people want to tell them that. But if we really want that out of this horrific moment of the bloodshed, if we want a true vision of peace and coexistence to emerge, the century-long Palestinian ideology that the Jews cannot have their state anywhere in the land, that ideology has to die. Thank you.
A continuación, si les parece, tenemos la oportunidad de abrir un turno de preguntas que pueden dirigir tanto a Einat como a Alberto, ya que tenemos la suerte de que ambos nos acompañan aquí, así que si alguno tiene alguna pregunta, sí.
Buenas tardes. ¿Me escuchan? Sí. Buenas tardes. Voy a hacer una pregunta. A ver, lo primero es apoyar a Israel totalmente, eternamente a Israel. Esa es la primera entrada. Lo segundo es cómo es posible que el 7 de septiembre permiten que los grupos terroristas asesinos, hijos de la gran puta, así, cómo es posible que entren por la frontera, asesinen a su antojo y el Sinbel y el Mossad no estén al tanto y lo permitan. Y lo segundo es que, a ver, Palestina no quiere que Israel sea un estado de paz, no lo quiere. Los árabes tampoco. Luego lo que me preocupa es el antisemitismo que hay ahora mismo aquí en España, en Europa, en todo el mundo. Es que es temible, tengo muchos amigos, pero que yo sepa que se cae de la mesa y los rebeldes están aquí, están ahí. Que yo apoyo a Israel totalmente.
Thank you so much for the sentiment. It certainly means a lot always and at this moment. And I know that it takes a lot of courage to say that these days. How did it happen? I can assure you that we ask this every day. We have those days when we were, did this really happen? How could it? But other than all the technical questions of intelligence failure and the defense of the border, I want to emphasize one thing, which I think has not been sufficiently noticed. The leaders of Hamás said after October 7th, in several interviews, they said, we were planning this for 2 years, and we tricked Israel into believing that we are now focused on improving Gaza. Now think about it. This is the entire conflict in a nutshell. What are the leaders of Hamas saying? Ha ha, look at those stupid, gullible Israelis. They actually thought that we care about our own people. They actually thought that we want to spend our efforts into turning Gaza into a better place. When all this time, we were planning the biggest, most murderous attack on the Jewish people. So this is, beyond anything, one of the tragedies of the Jewish people, is that we really want to believe that at the end of the day, the other side actually cares about doing good for their people more than they care about destroying us. And again and again, we delude ourselves that this is what they want. everything in our history, even now, we are still not sufficiently paranoid. So of course, there's a lot of technical reasons and intelligence failure and the failure to defend the border and too much of the military was in the West Bank and not in Gaza, and there's a lot of specific things. But for me, the biggest issue is that ultimately we wanted to believe that Hamas changed. And we were not sufficiently paranoid to realize that it was still the same old ideology and that nothing changed.
Muchas gracias por la brillante explicación, tanto histórica como del conflicto real y el objetivo real de Palestina y de los árabes. A mí me gustaría entender por qué Occidente no está de alguna forma ciego ante este objetivo real que existe en este momento y durante los últimos 100 años. Luego también me gustaría entender si habéis tenido algún tipo de percepción distinta en cuanto a posible antisemitismo desde el 7 de octubre y cómo compara esto con lo que habéis podido percibir anteriormente en los últimos 20-25 años. Muchas gracias.
So, why do people not first of all, I didn't see it. And it's only when everything I believed again and again met a reality that didn't make sense that I began to listen more carefully to what Palestinians were saying. And I think there's a lot of desire for self-delusion. Because if we really acknowledged what the Palestinians were saying, the work that would need to be done is of a different scale and magnitude. Much easier to say, Israel, stop building settlements, Israel, stop doing this, rather than confront a destructive ideology that existed for a century. It has a lot to do with this feeling good versus doing good. I remember a few years ago when Adi Schwartz, my co-writer, and I, we went to Brussels to speak to the person who's responsible for the funding of UNRWA, the agency that perpetuates for Palestinians the idea that the war of 1948 is not over, that generation after generation there's still refugees from that war, that they possess a fictional right into Israel. So Adi and I explained the history for about an hour, and at the end of it, he looks at us, and he says it at this pace. So you want to tell me that the reason we don't have peace is because Palestinians still want all of it? And Adi and I go, yes. But the next day, he still gave $300 million to UNRWA. So even if for a moment they might see it, it's inconvenient. I've invented a word in the book which is called West-plaining, which is when Western diplomats and journalists explain away what Palestinians say. So Palestinians will say, from the river to the sea, blah, 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 and Westerners will be like, their problem is with the Netanyahu government. And you know, where did that even come from? So there is a lot of wishful blindness, but there's also a lot of what relates to the second question. We have to admit and acknowledge that the only reason that Palestinians were ever interesting to the world, and they got attention, is because they fought the Jews. Otherwise, they would not get 1% of the media coverage, the global mobilization. Again, I must say the UN Secretary General just gives me a lot of material these days. So he said that the death in Gaza, the number of the civilian toll, is the worst he's ever seen as Secretary General. Now, why would you say something that's so easy to check? Because within minutes of him saying that, Twitter was filled with people saying, you've been Secretary General since 2017. This happened in Tigray in Africa, this happened in Yemen, this happened in Syria, this happened in Afghanistan. And the numbers were 10, 20 times larger, sometimes 100. So why would you say something like that? But it shows you the deep consciousness that only notices something when it has to do with Israel and the Jewish people. So the Palestinians were only ever interesting because they fought the Jews. And that's the tragedy of the Palestinians. Because to understand anti-Semitism is much less about personal prejudice. I hate Jews, I think Jews are too rich. That's the small part of it. Anti-Semitism at its most powerful is when it serves to create a political organization of a society to mobilize a society politically against the Jews. And it is always useful for failed ideologies and failed societies. René Girard, who studied the idea of scapegoating, said that societies in crisis can ask two questions: what to do and who to blame. Societies that ask what to do can come out of the crisis stronger and better. Societies that ask who to blame collapse into failure. But a lot of societies in crisis prefer to ask who to blame rather than what to do. And one of the most effective historical scapegoats in the West and in the Muslim world are the Jews. It's just too powerful, too effective for leaders not to use it. So it's not a coincidence that you had a synergy between the Palestinians fighting the Jews and all the failed ideologies that latched into them. Nazism in the 30s and 40s, once you learn, there's a lot of good books on that, on the Nazi impact on Arab ideology in the 30s and 40s, you can't unsee it. Pan-Arabism, which was really about uniting the Arab world against the Jews. Communism, another failed ideology that tried to prop itself up by creating anti-Zionism as the respectable mask for the old kind of anti-Semitism. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, another remarkable failure. Sunni jihadism, Shiite jihadism, the current left-wing extremism in the West, they are failed ideologies that in order to distract from their failures, they're saying those are to blame. And the Palestinians have been the willing recipients of all these ideologies. Every moment when Palestinians faced a crisis that could have led them to change, to say, look, this ideology of from the river to the sea is a terrible ideology. It led us to nothing but ruin. We need to change. Every time they could have had that moment, you had another failed ideology latch onto them and say, no, you don't need to change. Keep fighting the Jews. They're to blame. You have no responsibility whatsoever. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the combination of those failed ideologies using the organization against the Jews with the Palestinians to ensure that the Jewish people don't have a single day where they can just live in their state at peace and be left alone.
No, está bien. Puedo hablar sin English or Spanish.
Para la traducción.
Okay.
English or just...
Oh, I can speak English too. Okay, so I basically agree with most of the things you said. I'm a Jew, I live in Israel, and I have family in Israel, and I go almost every year. But many things that you say I don't agree, and I like to point them out. First of all, everything you said is victimizing, okay? We are the good guys against the bad guys. And there are many things, okay, first of all, I have to do a disclaimer. I don't conceive the war without the state of Israel, okay? We need the state of Israel. But if we don't accept the bad thing that we did, we're never going to achieve that peace. And you never mention any of that. And I live in Israel. I was living in Rishon LeZion, and before the Intifada, one guy stopped in the highway where the Arab workers were waiting for a day job, and he killed them all, okay? And I see many things like that. I witnessed racism all the time. I saw when Rabin was killed, and before that he made the Oslo Agreement, and people with Netanyahu party were calling him a killer, okay? And Netanyahu was rooting for that. You didn't mention any of that, okay? So, again, I love Israel, like I said, I live there, I speak Hebrew, everything, but unless we accept all the bad things, and those people were displaced, okay, they're never gonna go back, but they have to find some kind of compromise, and that requires to accept the bad deed. Like you didn't mention any of that. Why? We are the victims, and we're demonizing the other people that are doing the same. That doesn't lead us anywhere. That leads us to where we're witnessing right now. Okay, that's my position, and again, nothing.
So, I only discuss the issues that are at the core of the conflict. A lot of bad things were done, but they don't change the fundamental core of the conflict. When I post lectures or explanations that the conflict is between the Jews wanting a state and the Arabs wanting a state and the Jews not to have a state, I don't get any response from Arabs, only from Jews. I don't get any response from Arabs that says, you're absolutely wrong. We Arabs, we Palestinians, we support the Jewish right to self-determination in the land. We're only angry about the occupation, or we're only angry about the settlement, or we're only angry because you did this or you did that. No. They only dig themselves deeper. They say, of course you shouldn't exist because you are an apartheid, racist, colonialist settler state. Now again, you can believe that the Jewish state should not exist, you can feel justified, but it doesn't change the fact that this is the conflict.
But many Jewish people think the same about them.
So that's exactly the difference. On the Palestinian side, you don't have different voices.
I don't think so.
So I'll tell you to do what I ask everyone who tells me that. Because this is the repeated comment. Because what I say sounds very sweeping, very harsh. So a lot of people say, this can't be, just like there's all kinds of views in Israel, there's all kinds of views among Palestinians. And I tell them, look, because I made such a sweeping generalization, I made it so easy to take me down. It's so easy to disprove me. So go ahead. Bring me a Palestinian who, in their words, publicly, so in a video or in an op-ed or in a tweet, I never accept any Westerner who tells me, oh, I know Palestinians who think differently. because I told you, because of West Plain. No, Palestinians need to say that directly in their own voice. And I want to hear the following. We recognize that the Jewish people as a people have the right to self-determination in this land. We understand the implications, that this means we can't have it all and they can't have it all. We understand that it means that we're not refugees in our country and that we do not possess any right of return into the state of Israel. We only want to live in peace next to the Jewish state of Israel rather than instead. And I always tell them, if you think I made a crazy generalization, prove me wrong. And they never come back. And I look for these voices. So now, during the current campaign, I found one half Palestinian, half British, living in London, who says that. And we've become best friends and we promote those ideas. But he will tell you that there are no voices like him among Palestinians. And he writes it clearly. And the reason that I insist on those precise words is that during the years of Oslo, Shimon Peres had a vision. He said, when we negotiate peace, in peace, like in lovemaking, it's good to close your eyes a bit. Now, I don't know about lovemaking, I'm not, everyone to their own, but in peacemaking, it is a disaster. During the years of Oslo, there was this notion of constructive ambiguity. Let's not say anything really clearly, just make sure that people sign the agreement, and over time, things will be better. It's been destructive. So I developed the concept of constructive specificity. We need to be very, very clear. And we saw it during the Abraham Accords with the UAE. We saw it with Mansour Abbas, a courageous Arab Muslim leader within the state of Israel. When they want to make it known that they are no longer against the Jewish state, they are quite capable of saying it clearly in every language and in every form. So that's what we need to hear. And this is why, for example, the fact that Rabin was assassinated was terrible for Israel, but it made zero difference for peace. Because a lot of people are surprised by that. On the eve of his assassination, when Rabin outlines what an agreement can look like, he is to the right of what Netanyahu says later in his Bar-Ilan speech. People are surprised by that. And this is actually easy to prove, because 5 years after Rabin was assassinated, Ehud Barak goes to Camp David and puts on the table a proposal that Rabin would not have dreamt of proposing. And Olmert proposes it in 2008. And the Palestinians still walked away and waged a campaign of massacres. So that is not why we don't have peace. And why were Palestinians displaced? Out of magic? Because they said, and they said it, that they don't want the Jews to have their state. So when the United Nations said, look, the Jews can have a state, the Arabs can have a state, the Jews said yes, because remember, Bevan, the Jews achieved their top priority, a state. And they were unhappy. It was half of what was promised to them. It did not have Jerusalem. It did not have Judea. But they said yes because it fulfilled their top priority of finally be masters of their own fate in their own state. And the Arabs said no and went to a war of annihilation because partition didn't fulfill their top priority of no state for the Jewish people. And despite their best efforts, they lost that war because they waged that war for the Jews not to have a state. And they failed in that. And in wars, people are displaced. a quarter of the Jewish population was displaced by the Arabs. Does anyone talk about that? No, because Israel absorbed them, and they're Israelis. The hundreds of thousands of Arabs who were displaced in a completely unnecessary war, that they could have celebrated 75 years of a prosperous Palestine. No one displaced. But their top priority was for the Jews not to have a state. And not only were they displaced, which is not unique, people were displaced in countless wars during the 1940s and 50s, but they insisted, unlike any refugee population in the world, from new borders and new countries, that they will never settle, because their top priority is to continue to fight generation after generation for the Jews not to have a state, not to have a single day where they can just live in peace and know that this is their state. So yes, Israel did a lot of bad things, but none of them changed the essential point of the conflict, which has always been about the Jews wanting a state and the Arabs wanting the Jews not to have a state.
Well, in first place, congratulations, y Alberto, felicitaciones for, I'll speak in English, for the presentation. I find it extremely enlightening. Now, one of the, you would call byproducts of Yom Kippur was the peace agreements with Egypt, the return of the Sinai. How do you see this regarding what could happen now with Saudi Arabia? And once the waters go back, the Palestinian problem is there, but the rest of the Arab countries, we have who to target. So what do you think will happen? What is your prediction?
So someone wrote recently, I thought it was quite interesting. He said, the benefit we have with the Arab world, that even though a large share of us don't want Israel to exist, unlike the Palestinians, it's not their top priority. It's something that they would love to have as a second, third, fourth priority. So this leaves room for negotiations, because there's other things they care about. Egypt wanted to move from the Soviet bloc to the American bloc. So that was something that you could negotiate. But even Egypt is instructive. The idea with Egypt was land for peace. Israel gave all the land, the entire Sinai Peninsula to the last square centimeter. Egypt was supposed to give us peace. And it really shows you what low standards we are being asked to accept when we call what we have with Egypt peace. Because it's a really good non-belligerency pact. But that Israel actually already had in 1975 for about a third of the Sinai. So it was actually a better deal. But there's barely any diplomatic relations. There's no cultural relations. There's no economic relations. There's no tourism. Egypt is one of the most hostile countries to Israel and international bodies, and it's the #1 promoter and producer of anti-Semitic content in Arabic. I have an Egyptian friend who's the most pro-Israel person now, and he talks about how growing up in Egypt is anti-Semitism every day. And he said, if you want to understand Egypt, imagine that the Third Reich was a failed state, so no one would have bothered to fight it. He said, that's Egypt. And this is what we call peace. So, again, it's still better than the wars, and Egypt is an important Arab country, but we should still really look at what we got there. The Arab world in the Gulf, Saudi, the UAE, are a bit different. Because as I said, anti-Zionism as the heir of anti-Semitism is an ideology of failed society. What's interesting in what's happening in the Gulf is that they are less and less failed societies. They are actually increasingly the societies of what Arab and Muslim success looks like. This is what young Arabs want their country to look like. They are fashioning a different Islam that is based on moderation. I call normalization with Israel collateral benefit. We're not the central story here. The central story is those countries changing the sense of what it means to be Arab and what it means to be Muslim. And because they're increasingly successful, they don't need the ideology of failed societies, which is anti-Zionism. When the Abraham Accords were signed, I became close and friendly with Emiratis, Bahrainis, and I ended up co-writing an op-ed with two young Emiratis, a man and a woman. And the op-ed opened as follows: "We are proud Arabs, we are proud Muslims, and we're Zionists." They didn't run away from this word. And they said, "We see no contradiction between our proud Arab and our proud Muslim identity and the support for the Jewish rights to self-determination in their historic homeland." And they described decades of Arab anti-Zionism as a complete waste of time. What has the Arab world ever gotten from being against the Jews? What? Did it build anything for them? Did it create anything for them? They got rid of all their Jewish people. They spent resources fighting Israel. What good did it give them? And they realized that. They said this is an ideology of old people. It belongs to the past. We're a generation of the future, of success. We don't need this. And this is where I see hope. I'm under no illusion. Most of the Arab world still believes that we are white European settler colonialists who need to be thrown out, like the French in Algeria, like the Crusaders. They love to think we're the Crusaders. But finally, for the first time in history, we have an Arab and Muslim voice that looks at Israel, that looks at the Jewish people, that looks at Zionism and says, "Abraham, you are not foreigners. You belong here, and we embrace you because you belong here." It's still a small hope, but it's really the only hope that I see going forward. At the end of the day, the Jews, and with that I'll end, the Jews are destined, you might say damned, to remain a tiny, tiny, tiny ethnic, linguistic, national, religious minority in an Arab and Muslim Middle East. The 7th century conquests were very successful, so good for them. We will always be a minority. Even if all the Jews living abroad come tomorrow to live in Israel, even if we continue to make babies, we will always be a minority. So as long as we care about the land of Israel, the only way forward to peace is for the Arab world to accept us as Abraham. And I can assure you, because we're a small people, if the price of peace, real peace, not pretend peace, will be the West Bank, the settlements, all that, I can assure you that just as we did in 47 and 67 and in 2000 and 2008, because we're such a small minority, because we crave acceptance and legitimacy and finally being left alone in peace, we will, as we always did, say yes.